Welcome to Game Fondue Reviews. In this video we're going to take a look at Brass. Brass is a card-driven Euro game taking place during the Industrial Revolution in England. Let's jump right in with the description of the rules, see a few example turns being played, then I'll be back for some closing remarks. This is Brass set up for a 3-player game. To set up, each player is going to pick a color and take all building tiles in that color. Then they're going to put them face up in front of them in stacks based on type, and they're going to order the stacks in numerical order from lowest to highest. So you can see here the ports. The 1s go on top of the 2s, which go on top of the 3s, and so on, all the way down to the 4s. Aside from that, you give each player 30 money that they're going to keep in their play area. Then they're going to put one of their wooden discs on the 0 income space, on the income/VP track, and on the turn order track. Whoever's going to go first will put in the first spot, second, the second, and so on. Then just shuffle the deck of cards and deal each player a hand of 8. That's for their eyes only. Then you shuffle the distant market tiles and form a stack on the distant market space of the board. Then you're just going to put the cotton demand marker on the top of the cotton demand track, and you're going to fill the coal and iron demand with the corresponding resource. At this point, you're ready to start the game. The game is divided into 2 periods, which are composed of 4 phases each. They are initial cards, player actions, victory points, and end of period maintenance. At the end of the second period, whoever has the most points wins. In the initial cards phase of both periods, you're going to remove a certain number of cards from the deck based on player count and based on period. It's not the same number both periods. In a 3-player game, for instance, we remove 9 cards from the first period, so that's what we've done. We've put them aside face down. Nobody gets to look at them. In the second period, we're going to remove 6, but in a 4-player game in the first period, you would remove 6. In the second period, you would remove 2. After removing cards from the deck, you're going to move on to the player actions phase, which is the main part of the game where players are going to play cards from their hand to take various actions. The player action phase is composed of rounds consisting of 4 steps, which are collect income, play cards, turn order, and refill hand, and it's going to continue until all cards in the deck have been played, including the cards in all players' hands. So each round begins by players collecting income based on their location on the income track. You can see here the VP is actually the top number, but the income is the bottom number. So we all start at 0 income. So no player is going to earn any income the first turn of the game. It's also possible later in the game you're going to receive negative income, in which case you have to pay money from your supply. And this is the only time in the whole game that your money paid is not going to the amount spent box. Normally anything you pay goes right here to your corresponding color, but this would just go right to the bank. If you owe money and you cannot pay it, you're actually going to have to take some of your tiles off the board and regain money equal to half their cost. You can never voluntarily do that, but for instance, this costed 12 to build, so you could take it off the board. You would lose all points and corresponding things, but you would gain 6 money because that's half of 12. Each round, once all players have collected income, we're going to move on to the play cards step of the turn, in which each player is going to play 2 cards in turn order and take 2 corresponding actions. Also, I want to point out during the first turn of the game only, not the first part of the second half as well, just the first turn of the entire game only, each player is only going to play 1 card and take 1 action. During a player's turn, there's 5 possible actions they could take, and those are build tiles, build links, develop, sell cotton, or take loans, and they could take the same action twice, or they could take 2 different actions for their turn. The first possible action, which is to build a tile, is the only action in the game that matters what card you discard. You can either discard a city card, which are these cards that indicate a city on them, or an industry card, and they indicate a certain type of building that you have in front of you. If you discard a city card to perform this action, you can build in the corresponding city with no connectivity requirements. More on that later. But for instance, if you discard Manchester, you can build in Manchester. You can only build the things that shows in the different spaces. So for instance, you could build a cotton mill or a coal here, but you could not build a ship. You can always ever build from the top of your piles, and you can never build anything with a value of 0. You'll note that one of your piles starts with something at 0, so you're going to have to take another action later to get rid of that. Another thing to note is any tile with this canal symbol on it can only be built during the first half of the game, and anything with a rail symbol, which is that symbol there, can only be built during the second half of the game. Also, during the first part of the game only, you can only have 1 building in each city location. So for instance, if I've built a mill here during the first half, I cannot build another one. But during the second half of the game, you can have any number of buildings as long as there's enough spaces for them in each city. The only other thing to note here is if you build in a place that has the same industry pictured twice, you can see here, there's 2 different ports, but this one has an option. You could build a mill here. If you're building a port, you'd have to build in the one unique to the port first. You can't block somebody else from building the mill unless this is already filled. So in the example given, if I discard the Manchester card, I can build in Manchester. If I chose to build a cotton mill there, I would have to pay 12 money, and I would put it in the corresponding space. Remember, your money goes to here, so you would take that. By the way, silvers are 5, so it would go in your corresponding amount spent box. Now, some buildings will also have additional coal costs. Like you can see here, this ironworks requires a coal, and some buildings later in the game will also require an iron If it requires coal, you have to be able to transport it to the location. So again, let's pretend I played the Manchester card, but instead of wanting to build cotton mill, I wanted to build this ironworks here. And that requires 1 coal in addition to this monetary cost. I cannot do this at this time because I have no connection to any ports on the board. You'll note that these also contain ports, any of the external locations here. But you have to have a continuous link to somebody's already built port, whether flipped or unflipped, it doesn't matter, but more on that later. It doesn't have to be your own connection. But in order to get this coal, I'd have to be connected here or connected to a place that already has some coal on it. Because when you build an ironworks, you're going to put 4 iron on it immediately or whatever number's in that box. When you build a coal, you're going to put the indicated number of coal right in that box. So let's pretend this coal was here already, built by somebody else, because remember in the first half of the game I can't have 2 buildings in the same location, but I could in the second. I would just take one of these off. It's totally free because I can transport it there, and then I would be okay to build this because I have access to the coal. However, let's say this guy was up here with his coal, but there was no link between these. I could not do that. So instead I would have to go to a port, and that's the coal demand track here. So I would take the top one off and I would pay the corresponding cost. So normally this costs 5 to build, but because I have to pay 1 extra for coal, it's going to cost me 6. So I would pay that at the time, and then I can build that. But again, if I'm not connected to coal, either via this here, which is any port on the board, or via one of these, I cannot do it. If I can take off of here, I have to. So even if I had the choice of going from here and buying one for 1 or taking off one of this guy's for 1, I would always take off from him. Also, if there's multiple coal sources on the board, I have to take off the closest one. So let's pretend I was also connected up here and there was a coal on this guy. I would have to take from this one because it's only 1 connection away, while as this one is 2 connections away. But if you cannot supply the coal, and remember you have to be connected to a coal source to do so, you cannot build anything that requires coal. It's also important to note if the coal demand track is totally empty, you can still buy a coal as long as you're connected to a port. Remember, if you're not connected to a port, you cannot buy one, but it will cost you 5 money. And you always put your money in the amount spent box. Like coal, if you build something that requires iron, you have to be able to supply it. However, unlike coal, you do not have to be connected. So for instance, let's pretend there's a source of iron up here with some iron on it, and I'm only going to need 1 to build this. I would just take it right off of that. It's free because it's on the board, and then I can build this successfully following the normal rules. I still have to pay the cost. You never have to have any connection to iron. Also, same idea. If this is empty, there's no iron anywhere on the board, I can just freely pay off the iron demand track here. And there is the marker of the port to indicate that you must be connected to a port or a coal source for coal, but there's none up here. So you can always get iron as long as you can pay for it. If this is totally empty, it costs 5. But if you have the option to take from anywhere on the board, meaning somebody's place, or over here, you have to take from the board first. So if this was the situation, maybe I didn't want to take off from this guy's, I cannot choose to pay 1. I have to take 1 off from here. When you take them off, they just go back to the supply, but any cost you had to pay from buying from here goes to the amount spent box. It's also important to note with iron, you do not have to take from the closest source. So even if this guy was very nearby me, like he was right here, and this guy was up here, I could choose to take off my own if they both had iron on them. So that's how building with a city card works. You just play the city card and you can build in that city. You do not have to be connected to it. However, the industry cards indicate a certain type of industry. For instance, this lets me build mills and this lets me build coal mines, but I have to be connected to the location. So for instance, if I play this coal mine card, I can't just build freely in Oldham if I'm the purple player. I have to be connected with my own links. If there are links made by other players, such as the red player here, I would not be able to build here because I have no connection to it. But if I was connected there, then I can build that particular type of industry. And again, it comes off the top of my piles and it works exactly the same way. You have to be able to supply coal and iron as needed. There is one caveat here, however, and that's if you built nothing on the board, no links and no building tiles, and you play an industry card, you can build on any matching industry space on the board that you can supply coal and iron to, if needed. I also want to point out that Liverpool and Birkenhead are automatically connected for purposes of building with industry cards. What I mean by that is if you've already built in Liverpool, then you could use an industry card of a ship to build in Birkenhead. However, you cannot transport coal between these two. They're going to need separate supplies of coal, so you can't actually build this during the first period because they all cost coal and there's no way to get a link there. But more on that later. Before moving on to the other actions, there is one more rule regarding coal and ironworks that I want to cover. That is, when you build a coal plant, if you are connected to a port via any means, it doesn't have to be your own connections, and there are empty spaces in the coal demand track, like so, these will be back in the supply. When you place the coal on your tile as you would normally do, as indicated, you're going to immediately refill up the coal demand track, and you're going to take money for each thing you refill. So in that case, you would take 2, 4, 5, 6 money. But you do not do this if you're not connected to a port and there's not empty spaces in the coal demand track. And this works exactly the same for iron, but you do not have to be connected. You're always going to refill with iron as long as there's empty space. However, with a coal, if you're not connected when you're built and later you're connected, even if there's empty spaces and you have coal on it to fill them, you're not going to fill. It's just at the time the tile is built. Also, when a coal runs out of coal, meaning it's all back in the supply or in the coal demand track, or iron runs out of iron, it's all back in the supply, you're going to flip it over. When tiles flip, you immediately advance the owner's marker on the income track that many spaces. So we can see here there's a circle with a 3 in it. So if the yellow player flipped this, he would move up 3 spaces. That doesn't necessarily mean his income goes up by 3, but his income is now going to be 2 on future turns. And the coal is emptied, this guy would actually go up by 6 spaces on that track. And once a tile is flipped, it can never unflip, but that's how you advance income. The other tile that flips immediately when built is a ship. So if you ever build a ship, you're going to put it down and immediately flip it. You're going to gain some income. It also has a very high point value. Only flipped tiles are worth victory points in this game. One final aspect of building I want to touch on is building over tiles. Normally you can only build one tile in each location. However, you can always build over your own tile with a tile of the same type. It must match it, even if there's some places that allow you to build multiple types of things. It has to match the tile that was already built there, and you must build at a higher level. So for instance, I have a level 1 port here. I could build over that with a level 2 or 3 port of my own. If I choose to build over a coal mine or an ironworks, whether it's flipped or unflipped, if it already has some cubes on it, I would just wipe them off. They would return the supply when I built over it. And remember, this is a level 3, so I'd have to build over it with a level 4. There's also a very specific circumstance where you can build over opponents' ironworks and coal, and that's if there's none of the corresponding resource on the board. So an example with the coal, there would have to be no coal anywhere on the board, so even if there was one coal up here, you couldn't do it, and there'd have to be no coal in the corresponding demand track, and then ironworks the same way. The board and demand track have to be totally devoid of iron in order for you to build over somebody else's building with a higher level. Normally you cannot build over somebody else's. It's just a very specific case when that resource is totally depleted. In closing, normally you're going to discard one card and build one thing. However, if you'd like to, you can always discard any 2 cards. They can be the same or different and build anywhere on the board as long as you can supply with coal and the normal restrictions. So for instance, I could discard this cotton mill and this coal, and I could build in any location. I don't need to be connected to it. In that way, it's like I played a location card for that type, and I can just build there. So for instance, I discard these, and maybe I build an ironworks over here, even though none of these cards have anything to do with ironworks or with Rockdale. Also want to point out that counts as both of your actions for the turn, so that would be your entire turn of discarding 2 cards. And the very first turn of the game, you cannot do this because you're only allowed to discard 1 card. So with that, we move on to the next possible action, which is build link. All remaining possible actions are a lot easier to explain. So if you choose to build a link, you're going to discard a card from your hand as normal, but it doesn't matter what card you discard. It has no effect on the action whatsoever. In the first half of the game, you're only going to build canals, and they can only be built on spaces with these canal markers here. You'll see there's no canal connection between Ellesmere Port and Birkenhead. But in the second half of the game, you're only going to build rails, which are this here. So when you build a canal, it's going to cost you 3 money, and you can build 1 canal per action. But you can only build somewhere where you're connected to. You're connected to something if you already have a canal going into there, or if you have an industry in the spot. So for instance, you can see here, I can't just build a canal out here because I have no connection to it. I have no connection here either because red is here. Red could build a canal here during his turn, however. So maybe I want to put my canal here. I pay 3 to the amount spent area. And that's my action. I can only build 1 canal per action. In the second half of the game, however, when you're building rails, you can build 1 rail for 5 money or 2 rails as a single action with 1 card discarded for 15 money. But all rails also require a coal to be transported to them. That coal can be transported to either side. So for instance, if the purple player was going to build here, this coal could come down to here, and that would just return to the supply. Also, when you double build by paying 15, you're going to have to build a supply both with coal, and you have to do it 1 at a time. So if this was the situation, I couldn't build 2 rails here and then supply them with coal from here. I could build 1 here, supply it with coal, and then I could build another one here, and then I have to pay because this one is connected to the coal demand track and there's no coal on the board. So you can't just double build to establish the coal connection you need to build the second rail. You need to have both coal independently available to each. The only other thing to note there is if you do build 2 rails as a single action, they do not have to be connected. So for instance, I could put 1 here and 1 here as a single action for 15, provided I can supply the coal to both locations. Also, you can never build a rail or a canal in some other place that already has one. So for instance, yellow is the only person now that's going to have a canal here. No other player could build a canal here. The third possible action is to develop. And to develop, you can remove 1 or 2 tiles from the top of any of your stacks. It can be the same stack or different stacks, and they're just going to be out of the game. And you have to provide 1 iron for each. And remember, you don't need any connections to iron, but if there's some iron on the map, you're going to have to take that first. Taking off the map is free as usual, and taking from the demand track costs the indicated amount to the amount spent box. So for instance, this guy's going to discard a card. Doesn't matter what card he discards, but you're always going to discard one. The only action it matters for is building an actual tile. So maybe he decides he wants to develop this. That costs him an iron, so he's going to take off the board, and then he's going to develop this again, and that's going to cost him 1 money because there's no more iron on the board, so he would take that off by paying 1 to the amount spent box. And that's very important for getting to better value buildings deeper in your stacks, but you can either do 1 or 2, but each costs an iron. The next possible action is to sell cotton, and as usual, you're going to discard a card, but it doesn't matter what that card is, and you can sell cotton from any number of your cotton plants that have access to a port. Just like for supplying coal, they have to be connected. It doesn't have to be your own canals or rails, but they have to be connected to a location with a port, and these have ports as well. So let's put some cotton out on the board for this guy here. So he wants to sell some cotton, and he's not connected to any ports, so maybe he has to build some links first. But let's just say that he is now connected to this port down here. So you can sell cotton from any number of your cotton places as a single action. So if you have multiple, you can do multiple at once as long as they're unflipped. Once you flip a cotton plant, you can never sell from it again. So for his turn, he discards a card. Maybe he decides he wants to sell from both of these locations. So there's 2 options when selling cotton. You can sell to a face-up port, and you're just going to flip both of them. That's one way to sell. So you can see he's connected to this port here. So this would flip, and this guy would immediately gain his income, and the cotton would flip, and the player owning the cotton would immediately gain its income. However, they can sell to a face-up port or a face-down port or a port off the edge of the map via the distant market. And if you choose to sell to a face-up port via this way, it will not flip over. But this guy can sell to the distant market, this guy can sell to the distant market. Anybody that can sell normally can sell to the distant market, but you can only sell for flipping over if both of these are face-up. And you'd often want to do that to flip your own face down to get the extra income. But anyway, let's say he wants to sell to the distant market via this guy here first. So he's going to flip the top tile of this deck, and he's going to move down the indicated number of spaces here. So you see this is -2, so he goes down to here. So he's going to flip this guy because it didn't reach the bottom. If it reaches the bottom, you do not get to flip your cotton mill, and your action ends immediately. You do not get to sell any more cotton from anywhere else, and nobody can sell to the distant market anymore this entire half of the game. So they can the next period though. So this would flip over, you get the amount of income, and then you can continue selling. So this guy could choose to sell to here and flip both, or he could try to sell to the cotton demand market again. If he chooses to sell to the cotton demand market again, remember this won't flip, but he decides he'll just sell this way. But you can resolve all yours one at a time as long as you can sell the cotton because the building has not yet flipped. The only other thing to watch out for there is if you do sell to the distant market, you also gain income spaces equal to the amount you're at. So in our example, when this guy sold, he flipped over and moved down to here, he would get 2 additional in addition to the 5 he gets for flipping the cotton mill itself. So he'd move up 7 spaces on the income track. The final possible action a player can take on their turn is to take a loan. And as usual, you're going to discard a card, but it doesn't matter what the card does. And you can choose to take either a $10, $20, or $30 loan. And depending how much money you take, which you're immediately going to take from the bank to your area, you're going to move back a certain number of colors on the income track. So for every 10 you take, you move back 1 color. So you're always going to move to the farthest space along that color. So if this guy took a 10 money loan, he would just move back to here. If he took a 20, he'd go back to here. He took a 30, he'd go back to here. You never have to pay back the loans in this game, but you've lost the income accordingly. You can also not take a loan once the deck runs out in the second half of the game. The only other thing to note here is you can never take a loan that pushes you back below -10 income per turn. So if I'm here, I could only take a $20 loan because that would be 2 colors back, and I cannot go a third. Once all players have taken 2 actions or 1 during the very first turn of the game, we're going to move on to the turn order step of the turn, in which case you're going to reorganize the turn order based on who spent the most money. Whoever spent the most money will be last, and you can always count that in the amount spent box. And whoever spent the least money will be first, and second least will be second, and so on. So you would reorder. So for instance, if this guy only spent $2 and this guy had spent $6, we can clearly see that the red player would be second, the yellow player would be first, and the purple player would be third. And you're just going to wipe out the amount spent box at this time and move on to the next phase, which is refill a hand. Everybody's just going to draw back up to 8 cards. If the deck is empty, they will not draw back up, but you're still going to continue playing until all cards have been played, including those in the player's hands. After all cards have been played, you're going to move on to the victory point step of the turn, in which time players are going to score points based on the different tiles they have flipped in the board and based on their links. First, every tile you have flipped is worth a certain number of points as indicated in the hexagon at the bottom. So for instance, the red player would get 2 points, and he's going to score that on the same track as income, but with this marker here. Also, any unflipped tiles do not score, so we can see this guy is still face up here. There's no point value on this side, so he's not going to score anything for that because it was not flipped. Also, every player's canals score based on the number of circles on either side. So what I mean by that is you can see this canal here is touched by 1 circle, 2, 3 circles. So this canal is worth 3 points for the purple player. It doesn't matter what color these circles belong to, so even this yellow circle counts. Whereas this yellow one here is also worth 1, 2, 3, but this canal up here is just worth 1 because there's only 1 circle touching that canal. Also, I want to point out there's some locations on the board, like these external locations, that are worth 2 circles even though there's no tiles built on them. So a canal here, for instance, would be worth 2 plus the value of any circles here. Unflipped things do not show circles, so they're not worth points. Also, during the second part of the game only, this does not happen during the first. Each player is going to get 1 victory point for every 10 money they still have. After scoring in the first half of the game, not the second half of the game, there is a brief maintenance step, in which case you're going to wipe out from the board any level 1 tiles, whether flipped or unflipped. So we can see this is a level 1 port, a level 1. Anything with the 1 on it is just totally out of the board. It's out of the game. It doesn't go back to its owner's stacks or anything like that. Also, you're going to take all canals off the board. There's going to be no canals on the board for the start of the second half. I do want to point out, though, that these are limited, so the players do get them back. You can never build more canals or rails than the number you actually have. And also, players do not remove level 1s that are still on top of their various stacks. They actually have to develop to do that. But aside from this, the cotton demand just goes back to the top, and you're going to reshuffle all the distant market tiles to form a new distant market stack. And with that, you're going to start the second round. But remember, in the second round's first turn, everybody does play 2 cards as normal. But you're still going to remove some cards during the initial cards phase, depending on the player count. The second period works just like the first, except each player can build multiple places in one location as long as there's space. For instance, the purple guy could have 2 buildings here in the second half. But after the second scoring, whoever has the most points is going to be the winner. Let's go into this example playthrough. Normally players' hands are for their eyes only, but they're put face up here to make it easy to see. The first step of the turn is the initial card step, in which we remove some cards from the deck based on the player count and the period of the game. We're a 3-player game in the first period, so we remove 9 cards from the top of the deck, and they're secret and out of the game. So then we move on to the player turns part of the turn, and the first step is to collect income, but right now everybody's at 0 income, so nothing happens at this time. Now the players are going to take their individual actions in turn order, beginning with this guy here. Normally you would discard 2 cards and take 2 actions, but they're just going to take 1 action because it's the first turn of the game. So he decides to discard this card, and normally you can't build wherever you'd like with this. You have to be connected when you're using an industry card to build, but he decides because nothing's on the board yet, he can do it. He can put 1 in Bolton. So he's going to take a coal because that matches the card and put it right in Bolton by paying 5 money. So he's going to put the 5 money in the amount spent box, and he's going to put 2 coal on it because there's a black 2 on this space here. Now again, normally he would play a second card at this time to take a second action, but during this turn only, we're going to move on to the next player. That is the red player. So he's going to discard the Barrow and Furnace card, and he's going to develop. So it didn't matter what card he discarded because the develop action, you can discard any card and take it the same way. The way he's going to develop is he's going to take 1 tile off of this stack here, and he's going to take 1 tile off of this stack here. So with that, he's taken off 2 tiles, so he needs 2 iron to do that. So he's going to pay 2 money because 1, 2 is where they are right now. Future people would have to pay a little more. He's going to put that in the amount spent box. But these tiles he removed are totally out of the game, and he should keep his stack somewhat neat so he can tell what's on top of it. But with that, we're going to move on to the third player, who decides he wants to build an ironworks. And remember, ironworks requires some coal to build, and that's indicated on him. But he can put it right here, so he has coal to supply from right next to it. So he's got to pay 5 money, which he puts in the amount spent box, and then he's going to take 1 of these coals off here. Also, he would normally put 4 iron on it because that's how much is indicated here. But there are some empty spaces here, so he's going to put 1, 2 to refill the iron demand track, and he's going to take the 2 money from the bank accordingly. So he's going to gain that. And with that, everybody's taken an action during the first turn, so we're going to move on to the next part, which is to reorganize turn order. So it's going to be done in amount of money spent. So we can see red spent the least, so he's going to be first, and purple and yellow spent the same, so they actually stay in the same relative order. So then we just wipe these out, and we move on to the refill hands part of the turn. Everybody goes back up to 8, so normally they'll draw 2 cards, but this turn they're each going to draw 1. We're going to move on with the next turn, beginning with the income phase. We're going to jump ahead a little bit later in the game so you can see some more interesting situations. Welcome back. We progressed a bit in the game. We're still in the player actions part of a turn, but we're about to begin a new round, so everybody collects income at this time. You can see both the purple and yellow player are going to get 4 income, so they take that from the bank, while the red player actually has to pay 3 money. This is the only time in the game where you ever pay to the bank, not the amount spent boxes. So with that, we're going to begin the player turns, and we can see purple goes first because he spent the least amount last turn. So for his first action, he decides he's going to go ahead and take a loan, so he just discards a card, and he decides he wants a $30 loan, so he has to move back 3 colors. 1, 2, 3. So he's going to take 30 bucks from the bank. For his second card, he decides to play Blackburn to build, so he's going to build something in Blackburn. Now remember, he's not connected there, but he played the city card, so that's okay. If he played an industry card, he actually has to be connected to that location to build. It has to be by his canals, can't borrow somebody else's. Now Blackburn can hold mills and coal and ironworks. Unfortunately for him, ironworks and mills both cost coal for him at this point because of the level of his buildings on top, and there's no way to get coal in, because even though there's coal here, it's not connected. So he's going to go ahead and build a coal, and that cost him 8, and he needs to supply an iron for that. Because there's no iron on the board, he's going to have to pay 1 extra, so it's going to cost him 9 to build that there. So he's going to pay 9 to the amount spent box, and he's going to put the coal on his building as indicated. With that, we're going to jump ahead to the red player's turn. For the red player's first card, he's going to discard a card. He's going to sell cotton. So he has 2 unflipped mills on the board, and both of them are connected to at least 1 port. So he can sell cotton via that port. He can choose if he wants to flip the port itself or sell to the distant market. For his first one here, he decides he's going to use this port to sell to the distant market. So he does not flip it. So he's going to reveal the first tile. It's a -1. So then he goes ahead and flips his tile because he didn't reach the bottom space here. So he immediately moves up 4 on the income track, plus 3 because that's where the cotton demand is on the far end track here. So he's moved up 7 income. Now he can decide with this one if he also wants to sell to the distant market or if he wants to sell to this thing here. He decides he really doesn't want to flip the yellow player's marker, so he's also going to sell to the distant market. So he reveals a tile. It's a -2, so he moves down 2 spaces. Again, not at the bottom, so he's allowed to flip. So he gains 4 by flipping that one. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then he gains another 2 from the distant market. For his second action, he discards a card and he decides to build a link. Remember, you can build a link anywhere you're already connected to, and you're connected to somewhere if you have a link going in or if you have a building there. He decides to build one right here because he's connected here, so he can go ahead and do that for 3 money. So he puts the 3 money in the amount spent box, and he now has a link there. You can only build 1 link per action in the first half of the game. We'll come back at the end of this phase so you can see the scoring step occur. Welcome back. The purple player just played their last 2 cards. Now all players are out of cards in their hands, so we're finished the first half of the game. We're going to move on to the scoring step, in which case players are going to earn points for everything that's flipped over of theirs and points for each canal they have on the board. So let's start with the yellow player up here. This canal is worth 2 points because it's connected to 2 circles, which are these here. There's no circles here, so he's just going to advance 2 spaces with his VP marker. We're going to take these off the board as they go because after the first scoring, all the canals are wiped off the board, along with any level 1 buildings like this one you can see here. For this one, he's going to get 1, 2, 3, 4 points because this touches 4 circles, so he's just going to advance 4 more, and it's going to proceed like this with ones here going 1, 2, 3, 4 points as well. So after everybody scores, as mentioned, we're going to wipe off all the level 1s and all the canals. Also, we're going to reshuffle the distant market deck, put this back to the top. Then we're going to reshuffle all the cards in the deck, even those we removed at the beginning of the game, and discard some more from the deck. In a 3-player game in the second half, you remove 6 at the beginning of the game. Then you're going to have another set of turns just like this. Then there's going to be another set of rounds that work exactly the same way, except players can build multiple buildings in a single location. Remember, in the first half, they're limited. Only 1 purple could be built in here, for instance. And then there's going to be 1 more scoring, which works exactly the same way, except at the end of the game, players also get 1 point for every 10 money they have. We'll jump back at that time so you can see the final situation. Welcome back. It's getting near the end of the game. We're out of cards in the second half. It's the yellow player's turn. He's already taken his first action, but for his second action, he's going to do something you're not normally allowed to do. And that is he's going to build over another player's coal mine. The way he's going to do that is he's going to discard Warrington and Runkin, which is the location. And because there's no coal in the coal demand track and there's no coal anywhere on the board, he can do this with a higher level coal, which he has. The top of his pile is a 3, so he's going to build over this purple player's, which is totally out of the game. The purple player does not lose the income they've already got, but they are not going to get the points again during this scoring round. So he pays 8 plus 1 because the iron demand top one he's going to need is 1, so that's 9 total. So he's going to put his 9 in the amount spent box, and then he's going to fill this with coal as normal. But because he is connected to a port, there's one actually in the same spot, he's going to refill here, so he's going to get 4, 8, $14 total for these spaces, and he's going to immediately flip this, which advances him 6 in income. With that, we're going to move on to the next player's turn, and we're going to come back at the end of the game for the final scoring. Welcome back. We just finished the last turn of the second period. Now we're at the end of the game scoring. Scoring is going to work exactly the same for the links. So for instance, this yellow player here is going to get 1, 2, 3 because there's 3 circles around this one. We can just take it off the board. They'll get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for this one here, and so on. Also, players score points for all of the flipped buildings. Unflipped buildings are worth nothing. And finally, at this part of the game only, this did not happen in the first half, players are going to get an additional 1 point per 10 money they have. So for instance, this guy has 30 money, he's going to get 3 points. This guy down here doesn't quite have 10, so he's not going to get any. At this point, whoever has the most points wins the game. Brass is not for everybody. It's not a game I get to the table that much because I have a difficult time teaching it to new players. In particular, that building action has a lot of special cases that can be a little bit hard to grasp for new players. There's also a big barrier to entry for new players, and then it's going to be very difficult to compete with more experienced players. Not just because the game is very strategic, which it is, but because it's hard to grasp exactly how those tiles flip, and that's how you get all your income and points in the game. That being said, it is an amazingly well-designed Eurogame, and if you're willing to get past that barrier to entry, it is a lot of fun. Also, the gameplay is much quicker as you become more experienced because you're basically just throwing down 2 cards and taking action, so the game time should reduce significantly as you get more into it. I think this is the type of game you know immediately if it's for you or if it's not for you, but it is a very strategic one. There's a lot of different paths to victory, different things you can build that make the game different every time. So if this is your type of Eurogame, I strongly recommend you check it out, but you have to understand this is not a game that everybody's going to want to get into. That's Brass.